Magic the Gathering is a card game where cards are drawn from a deck, and this naturally introduces a certain amount of randomness. Sometimes draws are good, other times they're less good. I imagine this isn't news to you if you play this game a lot, either that or you've had a luck streak worthy of legend. In the worst case, you've got the dead card, a card that you draw and it doesn't do anything meaningful whatsoever. To some extent, this sort of draw is just a fact of life, and it's not something you're going to be able to fully avoid. Drawing a land when you don't want one, or not drawing a land when you do, will always be a struggle, and though MDFC's utility lands and other tools can mitigate some of this unfortunate variance, it will always be a somewhat present force. But what about among non-land cards? Well, the number of non-land draws that end up being more or less dead can vary immensely deck to deck, and this number will often result from the specific choices that went into the deck building process. So in this video, I'm going to go through the sorts of cards that often end up being dead draws in a deck, and how to make your deck play more smoothly without harming the things you enjoy about it. To start with, let's talk about an example of a deck with more or less no dead non-land cards. A deck with 35 swamps and 64 rat colonies. All of this deck's non-land cards synergize with each other, and you'll generally never draw a card and have it be entirely useless. However, this obviously comes at a cost. An exclusively rat colony and swamp deck has an exceptionally specific game plan with little to no flexibility. Either a board with a moderate number of high-power, low-toughness creatures wins you the game, or it doesn't. I choose this example not as a point of aspiration, but rather as an indication of what reduces dead draws. These rat colonies have no variation in the tasks they perform, all creatures that can beat down opponents, and they also all synergize with each other. So the start of dead draw mitigation starts by paying attention to these two things. What does a card accomplish, and what else does it synergize with? Let's start by discussing the latter. EDH as a format encourages synergy, and by synergy I simply mean cards doing more together than they do on their own. This is the case because the format is 40 life instead of 20, and has 3 opponents instead of 1. Conditions that necessitate that gameplay be volumetrically larger. You simply gotta have more stuff going on. Obviously, the most simple version of this is the rat colony example. Your deck is made up of a creature that will have more power the more copies of it that are in play, but this isn't enough volume for a lot of EDH games. So let's take the example of a somewhat larger lad, Kyler, Sigardian Emissary. Kyler is a 5-mana 2/2 that gets a +1/+1 counter whenever another human enters, and gives your other humans +1/+1 for each of those counters. So this is a commander who can dramatically power up a board of humans if left unchecked, but whose high mana cost and small starting stat line make him a bit of a removal magnet. Naturally, the primary synergy package here is humans, but different cards have different profiles of the situations in which they're good. Coppercoat Vanguard is good as long as you have other humans. Pretty decent assumption for a humans deck, and also gives the commander a bit of extra protection. This card should rarely feel useless, and could even be a pretty solid anthem if there are tokens out. That brings me to another card. Increasing Devotion is a large-scale token creator, and this one is slightly more complicated in its power profile. It's fantastic if you currently have Kyler on board, plus some other humans to swing with. It's decent if you have some other human ETB effects on board, like Lost or Not Captain or Champion of the Parish in play. Also decent if you have an Anthem at the ready to pump them up in size, and pretty mediocre if you have none of these support cards. The flashback prevents it from ever feeling truly horrible, but it might be a passable play at best if you have neither the commander available, nor any of the 15-ish cards in the deck that can amplify this card up to being a decent play. Most of the popular synergy cards for a Kyler deck will do things with humans, and with some exceptions, most of these will be pretty okay. However, synergy can go a bit deeper. You can venture into the magical world of sub-themes. Take +1/+1 counters. The commander uses them, and the average Kyler deck has around 12 cards in the 99 that also feature +1/+1 counters, so some players choose to add Metastatic Evangel, a card that proliferates whenever another non-token creature enters under your control. Paired with the commander, this card can turn powerful plays into utterly earth-shattering plays, but it also doesn't do much to smooth over Kyler's weaknesses. If he gets removed, the counters go with him. Put into the average Kyler deck, this card benefits 12 other cards, which isn't nothing, but also isn't great. Paired with its somewhat ephemeral support of the commander, I'd skip this card personally. Now, does this mean our Phyrexian Cleric friend belongs in no decks? Not necessarily. Some players might be running larger numbers of +1/+1 counter cards than the average player does, and others might be building the deck in a way that's likely to keep Kyler around more of the time. This card might even be a star player in some of these decks. It's certainly not a bad card. But these are the sorts of considerations you should be making when you're deciding whether or not to add a synergy piece. How often will it be in a situation to support other cards, and how substantial will that support be? When I'm building decks, I'll typically keep track of support for different themes and subthemes via Architect's category system. I'll have the baseline categories I put cards into, but also secondary categories for things like Flicker, ETB, Graveyard Enabler, Graveyard Payoff, and so on. When I'm adding cards and trying to flesh out a list, I'll be mostly viewing the deck on the Primary Categories tab to keep things visually neat, but as I start to prune and sculpt the list, I'll start bouncing back and forth between that and the Multi-Category tab, and see if the various parts of my deck have the right amount of support. This multi-category approach is also nice for evaluating individual cards, because I can immediately see and be reminded of all of the reasons I included a particular card, which also indirectly tells me the situations in which a card will be useful. As an example, let's take a card in a sub-theme heavy Phyrexian deck I recently built, Vat of Rebirth. The categories here tell me that it's a source of value that's payoff for having things in the graveyard. So as a baseline, I can check how much stuff I have that helps me get things into the graveyard, with a focus on creatures, since that's what this can reanimate. However, the other categories also tell me things about this card. This card will be stronger alongside counter amplifiers like proliferate cards, and it'll also be stronger when I have untap effects on the field. It's also an artifact, and a low-cost one at that, so it'll synergize with several other cards for that reason alone, and those cards are already helpfully organized into a category for me to check on. I can think about all the other combinations of cards this card may or may not be on the field with, and based on that, I can approximate roughly how often this card will be useful, and roughly how often this card will be dead. The answer for this card is that it'll be dead some modest percentage of the time in the early game, maybe 25% of the time, but there are also situations where it'll be very powerful due to other supporting pieces being around, so I've currently deemed it worth staying in. I also love the art and flavor of the card, which does end up being a non-negligible factor for a lower power deck like this. So that's synergies, but that's only one part of what makes a card dead or not dead. Another big factor to keep in mind is what stage of a game a card is useful in, and before I get into that, I briefly want to introduce a concept: Quadrant theory. This sounds complicated, but it's basically just a way of analyzing different situations in which a card could be played. A basic example goes something like this. We have this 4-quadrant box, and in this case we'll choose to label the top side based on the size of an opponent's board, and the left side based on the size of my board. Now let's consider the card Teleportal. How is this in different situations? Well, if we both have small boards, this card sucks. Not many creatures to affect, and not many creatures to get past. If I have a small board and my opponent has a large board, well, this is still pretty bad, but maybe there are some niche scenarios where it lets me get in for the last couple points of damage after my opponent has stabilized against my aggression, and it can be cast single target for 2 mana in a pinch. If I have a large board and my opponent has a small board, well, the unblockable isn't doing much, but at least I'm getting a power buff on all my creatures. Where this card is a straight up banger is when we both have large boards. This is the sort of situation where I'm probably praying for this card as a top deck, since it's getting maximum effect. This concept was originally designed with limited formats in mind, where cards are typically simpler and players tend to be on the lookout for narrow slivers of advantage. Fundamentally, though, Quadrant theory has a straightforward and universally applicable purpose. It exists to make sure that you're thinking about all of the situations a card might exist in, not just the ideal ones. A variant of this might be to analyze a card based on the stage of the game we're in. Take a card in a mid-power deck. How is that card in the early game? How does it fare in the mid-game? Now, decks will typically gain more card advantage over the course of the game, so it's fine to weight your analyses a bit more heavily toward the later parts of the game, as long as you have the support to get there, but you should still consider different versions of that late game. There will be the version of the later game where you're hitting your stride without setbacks, but what happens if a board wipe was played? How about if you have your board, but your life total has been taxed heavily by a more aggressive deck? How about if a mid-range opponent is pulling far ahead, and you need to either kill some key permanents or heavily diminish their life total? Different games will demand different things, and you should figure out how your different cards play in those different games. For a simple example, let's talk about my Rata deck, a deck designed to be as resilient and consistent with its gameplay as possible. It typically curves Mana Dork Commander into 4 mana ramp spell into 6 and 7 drops, with the goal of continuing to ramp and eventually getting to 20 or more lands. With that in mind, let's talk about a couple cards that are present here. Drakuseth, Maw of Flames, is a 7 mana 7/7 flyer that deals 4 damage to one target and 3 damage to 2 targets when it attacks. Oddly, this is a card that I'm actually most excited to see early, as landing it on turn 4 can be a pretty backbreaking opener if it doesn't get removed, due to its sheer power as a removal engine. However, it's still plenty solid as a top deck later in the game, what with its good flying stat line and attack ability that remains respectable, even if the creature size game has been heating up a bit. This sort of card is a good symbol of what this deck is best at. It's just always decent. For an example with a decidedly different power profile, let's consider a different card, Captivating Crew. Now, this card is pretty bad in the early game. 4 mana to threaten an opposing creature is just never what I want to do with my mana in the first 6 turns of the game, and I'm rarely all that happy when my turn 4 or 5 Cascade card pops out this treason triggering troop rather than a ramp spell. However, what keeps me from cutting the card is its sheer versatility in the late game. As long as I have enough lands, it almost always feels good. If I'm ahead on board, I can pull the last 2 or 3 blockers out from under an opponent and smack them down before they have the chance to stall things out. If I'm behind on board, it often means that I had a more aggressive but worse scaling rollout in the early game, in which case I can often leverage opposing life totals to get some favorable chump blocks, or at least utilize some abilities on opposing creatures. If the board is in a state of parity, it's the best of both worlds. I can nab my opponent's best threats and turn a 5 attacker 5 blocker standstill into an 8-2 or 9-1 smackdown. I was a bit hesitant to add this card to the deck initially, but the sheer consistency with which it feels great in the late game has made it one of my favorite top decks. So far, the lesson of this video has been more or less, be careful with cards whose use cases are highly specific. But I can already hear some of you saying, "But Alex, I want to play those cards. You're describing a lot of my favorite cards. Are you telling me I need to cut those?" And the secret third part of this video is that you can play those cards, and you can do it fully responsibly. But doing so requires one specific thing: card selection. This may be achieved by playing lots of filtering, or by playing a generally high velocity deck, but the basic principle is simple. Dead cards won't matter as long as you simply see more cards. A basic example of this might be an ongoing source of filtering like Merfolk Looter. It's not card advantage, but it doubles the number of new cards you see each turn and lets you get rid of any that aren't immediately useful. Same deal if you play lots of Scry or lots of selective draw. Don't like the card on top? Ditch it. Don't want a card in the top 4? Great, pick a different one. This even goes for actual factual card advantage. If your deck is consistently able to set up multiple extra cards per turn in advantage, that's often going to outpace your ability to cast what you draw, and as long as you have more useful stuff to play instead, there's really no harm in drawing that situational card. This was a major fact of life back when I played a mono black deck in my youth. I'd find one of my massive sources of draw, and then suddenly I could cut effortlessly through the quagmire of redundant pieces and specific answers that made up the top of my library. At the end of the day, all I'm trying to do is make you aware of the forces at play here. If your deck feels sluggish or awkward or swingy, there's a good chance dead cards are playing a major contributing role in that feeling. If you frequently find yourself unable to meaningfully contribute to a game for stretches of time, it might be time to audit the contents of your deck. There are so many cards that look great and ingrain themselves in our brains as simply a part of our deck, basically getting to skip any sort of auditioning process for simple vibes reasons. I ran Don't Blink in my Shroom Slide deck for several months because the elevator pitch for it sounds great. It's a card with cycling that can also be a big source of removal if I have Astral Slide out, turning those exiles into somewhat more lasting removal. However, when I examined what this card is actually accomplishing, it doesn't fit into the desired profile of a removal spell with cycling at all. I can cycle it, which is cool when I have some sort of cycling engine already up and going, and I can also cast it normally, which is cool when I have an even bigger sort of cycling engine already up and going. Missing entirely is the part of the card that has any sort of impact on the game when Astral Slide isn't in play, outside of wasting 2 mana, and as a result it got cut for the far superior card, Spectacular Pileup, when Aether Drift came out. For a simple exercise, think about the cards in your deck and try to notice. Is there a card where you seem to be thinking something along the lines of, "This card hasn't seen any great games yet, but it's awesome in theory"? If that's the case, you're going to want to double check your theories a bit and take a longer look at that card. Thanks for watching, and thanks to my patrons for supporting the channel, some of whom are on screen now. I'm actually gearing up for a cool patron video soon, which will go something as follows. I'll take card suggestions from patrons, then I'll be running a poll with a bunch of those cards to determine 3 of them that I'll need to construct a deck around. Then I'll build the deck and put a video out on my Patreon that details what the deck does and the process of constructing it. If you want to be part of the input for that, you can sign up for my Patreon for $3 a month.